our son Trevor came home from his 15-month deployment to Afghanistan, his 1-year-old child didn't know him at all. His mother's health had prevented her from raising him, and so, in their absence, my husband and I had reared our grandson since infancy. Our grandson viewed us as his parents, but Trevor needed to help his child change that. One night, I remember Trevor asking me to please leave the baby's bedroom after we'd prayed over and said goodnight to him, with the explanation, I want to be the last one to leave the room at night and the first one to arrive in the morning. Trevor knew his son was too young to understand very much about his life and certainly about all the tragedy that had befallen his young family since his birth. Yet Trevor was seeking to communicate to his son something he knew the baby could grasp. I will be here for you. When you sleep and when you rise, I am here. God has given us His Word in order to reveal Himself to us. Like my grandson with his father, our ability to comprehend God is very limited. The creation account wasn't written in order to give us all the scientific details of creation. Now, what it does says is absolutely scientifically accurate. However, God's intent wasn't to explain the how of creation so much as the who of creation. He wants us to know Him. My son wanted his son to know something about who he is, to understand their relationship to one another, and to know how he felt about him. Similarly, God has given us the account of creation to reveal who He is, define our relationship with Him, and know how He feels about us. In this lesson, we find a great deal of information about who God is. The following lessons will help us find answers to the other two questions. There are a number of things God has revealed to us about His nature, but I'm only going to highlight two. Genesis is actually a Greek word that means beginning. The theology contained in it sets the stage for all the other teachings of the Bible. The first 11 chapters of Genesis cover the affairs of the entire human race over thousands of years of primeval history. The remaining chapters of Genesis revolve exclusively around one family and the lives of the 4 men we call the patriarchs of Israel. To summarize, Genesis tells us who God is, the history of the ancient world, and also the history of the particular race of people who safeguarded all this knowledge and through whom it's been transmitted to the rest of the world. While 4 men dominate the last chapters of Genesis, chapters 12 through 50, 4 main events dominate chapters 1 through 11. These events are the creation, the fall of the first man into sin, the flood as God's judgment on the end of an era, and the Tower of Babel incident, which resulted in the division of people groups and God's choosing of one race. Conservative scholars generally accept that Moses wrote Genesis and the 4 books of the Old Testament that follow, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Jesus called these books the books or law of Moses in Mark and in Luke. Together, these 5 books are known as the Pentateuch, which means 5-volumed book. With regard to the events in Genesis, obviously Moses wasn't an eyewitness. He probably knew something about Israel's patriarchs from oral tradition. But no human being witnessed creation. God must have directly revealed the information in the early chapters of Genesis to Moses. But why would God have chosen to reveal the information about creation at that time in history, in Moses' day, rather than to an earlier or a later generation? It always helps us understand the Bible better to know something about what was going on historically at the time each book was written. To do so, we must jump ahead a bit in the story of the Bible to the time in which Moses actually lived. 400 years after Abraham's time, God raised up Moses to lead the Israelites, Abraham's descendants, out of slavery in Egypt. For 40 years, Moses and the Israelites wandered in the desert. Most likely, this is the time Moses put the first 5 books of the Bible into writing. When exactly might God have revealed the creation account to Moses? We can't know for certain, of course, but one interesting theory offers a reasonable explanation. You see, according to Exodus 3, when Moses was first called by God to deliver the Israelites from captivity in Egypt, he asked God, "Who am I that I should be the deliverer? And suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' Then what shall I tell them?" God answered Moses on that occasion, "I am who I am. Tell them, the I am has sent me to you." Up to that point, Israel had been in Egypt for roughly 400 years with nothing but oral traditions about the God of their forefathers. They knew about the many gods of Egypt, but who was this I am? Moses needed to know who was calling him to such an enormous task. Could I am equip him to do it? He also knew the Israelites would need to be convinced that the God who was calling them his people and telling them to courageously walk out of Egypt was actually powerful enough to make this happen. Hearing the creation story surely would have given Moses and the Israelites the confidence they needed. The first chapter of Genesis describes creation being called into existence by God out of nothing. The Latin term is ex nihilo. God is and was the first cause. Creation is the greatest miracle of all time. Think about it. If God created everything from nothing, any other miracle, raising the dead, allowing a man to be swallowed by a giant fish, causing the sun to stand still in the sky for 24 hours, instantly restoring to health those who were infirmed since birth, and giving new spiritual life to all who come to Jesus by faith. All of that is easy to accept. If creation was not an act of God, well, then there are only 2 possible explanations about the origin of the universe. That everything sprang from absolutely nothing, an idea no one seriously believes since it's totally unreasonable, or that it arose from random, impersonal forces. This is the atheist's viewpoint, that matter has simply always existed and everything else that exists does so by random chance. Many who hold this theory accept the Big Bang theory. They just can't explain where the matter and energy that caused the explosion came. The scientific evidence for the Big Bang theory is overwhelming. While the Bible doesn't say anything about a Big Bang, there's nothing in the theory that actually contradicts Genesis. Contrary to popular belief, the Big Bang cosmology does not presuppose biological evolution. In simpler terms, you can accept the possibility or even the likelihood of a Big Bang without believing that mankind evolved from lower life forms. You see, the Big Bang theory addresses the question of the origin of space and time, not the question of the origin of biological life. As one author wrote, the biblical account of creation doesn't conflict in any way with the Big Bang theory. We just know who banged it. The late Robert Jastrow, an American astronomer and planetary physicist, was a self-proclaimed agnostic. Yet here is his conclusion in his own words. Astronomers now find they have painted themselves into a corner because they have proven by their own methods that the world began abruptly as a product of forces they cannot hope to discover. That there are what I or anyone would call supernatural forces at work is now, I think, a scientifically proven fact. End of quote. Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and earth, is loud and clear. Before creation, before time, before anything, there was God. But some have wondered exactly what Genesis 1:1 describes. Does this verse speak of God's first act of creation, the heavens and the earth? It speaks of the heavens and the earth. Or is it a comprehensive, summarizing statement of the details that follow? If verse 1 describes an actual act of creation, at the very least it must imply that God created matter, the substance from which all things are formed. The universe, in its most primitive form, exploded into existence at the command of the eternal, transcendent God. Verse 2 speaks of creation as formless, empty, and dark, terms that, as some point out, are not used to describe any act of God elsewhere in Scripture. In fact, some scholars find these descriptive terms to be inconsistent with the work of God. Well, there are at least two ways to understand this. The first view is not concerned with these terms as being inconsistent with the work of God. This view merely points out the fact that at this point, creation was unfinished. God took what started as formless, empty, and without light, and then brought everything as we know it into existence during the 6 days in which he worked, as verses 3 through 31 describe. The second view says that the formless and dark condition described in verse 2 portrays an undesirable state and may suggest a gap exists between verses 1 and 2 in which a catastrophe must have occurred, perhaps the judgment of a pre-Adamic race, which could include the fall of Satan and his angels. This view proposes the possibility that the earth could have been without form and void for millions of years. It was a chaos of wasteness, emptiness, and darkness, they say. According to this view, the remainder of chapter 1 then describes a restorative work of God. Well, regardless of which view one takes, verse 2 also tells us the Spirit of God hovered over all that was created. An intentional, anticipatory act of preparation, just as God's Spirit hovers over hearts today, preparing them to receive God's truth and preparing them for fruitful work. From verses 1 and 2, we learn that our God is creator of all, is active and powerful, exists as a spirit, is a personal being with intelligence and will, and carefully considers, prepares, and initiates or hovers over his work. We also learn that God transcends his creation. That is, he's separate from it, and therefore not bound by time or space. He existed before these. That fact forces us to acknowledge that empirical evidence, that is what we know with our physical senses, is insufficient to reveal all truth. There is something bigger, someone bigger. In his book, The Knowledge of the Holy, A.W. Tozer suggests that we often make the mistake of viewing God as the highest in an ascending order of beings, from a simple cell going on up from the fish to the bird to the animal to man to an angel to cherub and then to God. But God's transcendence means that he is in a category all by himself. All created things are in a category of that which is not God. But God stands alone, entirely apart from all created things. He stands apart in unapproachable light. Each of us has, in one way or another, found life to be disappointing. We search for something beyond ourselves, something bigger. The God who transcends creation is the something more for which we long. That's our first principle. The God who transcends his creation is the something more for which we all long. At the time God revealed the creation account to Moses, the Israelites were certainly disappointed with their lives. They and their ancestors had been slaves for generations. To make matters worse, the false teaching of ancient Near Eastern lore allowed for no clear distinction between the gods and the elements. For centuries, the people of Israel had heard superstitions about the sun, the sky, the water, and the land that abounded around a pantheon of gods. With the revelation of Genesis 1 to Moses, God corrected this thinking. He wanted Israel to know, and he wants us to know him as the one who transcends life. He is the something more for which we secretly long. The something more we crave is not anything we will do for God. Did you get that? It's not something we will do for him. Using our spiritual gifts won't fill this longing, nor will obedience to God's command. It's also not anything we'll discover in his creation or in his many gifts to us. God stands alone in the category of something more. It is God himself we crave. Well, beginning in Genesis 1:3, 6 days of creation are described. Since the word day can be literal or figurative, Bible students frequently debate the term's meaning in Genesis 1. 4 views have been proposed. The first view is that each day was a literal 24-hour period of divine creative activity, based on the recurring phrase, and there was evening and there was morning. The second view is that each day was a literal 24-hour period, but a 24-hour period during which God revealed his creative acts to Moses. The third view is that each day represents an extended geological age prior to man's presence on the earth. The fourth view is that the days are used as a non-literal and non-sequential literary framework to present God's creative work topically. In other words, all the events described are exactly what God showed Moses, but Moses arranged the events in a memorable way. This view is enjoying great popularity at present. The primary support for it is found in the fact that the 6 days described clearly fall into 2 triads that parallel one another. In the first 3 days, the realms of light, sky, with the deep water below it, and land are created. In the second 3 days, God is described as creating things that dominate or rule over each of the spheres that are portrayed in the first triad. Light is described in day 1. The sun, moon, and stars are described in day 4. The fish of the sea and the birds of the air dominate the sky above and the deep waters below in day 5. The land creatures and mankind dominate the land and its vegetation in day 6. Although Bible students are likely to continue debating views of the days of creation, none of these views distract from the critical information that God brought all creation into existence, and he did so by his spoken word. The Hebrew word for word is D-A-V-A-R, Devar. Interestingly, Devar is also the Hebrew word for deed. When God speaks, it is done. The first mention of God speaking is in verse 3, where God said, "Let there be light." The fact that the text says God created light on the first day, yet the heavenly bodies, the sun, moon, and stars, aren't created until day 4, doesn't necessarily mean the days of creation aren't sequential. Old Testament British scholar Gordon Wenham reminds us light is a form of energy and may be produced in many different ways, not just by the sun and the stars. Contemporary cosmologists say that the universe began with a big bang, big hot bang, which must have made a very bright light. In days 5 and 6, God created living creatures according to their kinds. The Cambrian explosion, as it's called, refers to fossil records that demonstrate a very sudden, abrupt, and out of nowhere appearance of most major animal phyla on Earth, rather than by a progressive process of natural selection. Many proponents of evolution fail to concede that Charles Darwin himself acknowledged this in the mid-1800s as one of the main objections that could be made against his theory. The Cambrian explosion has been called biology's Big Bang. Both seem to offer scientific confirmation of what Genesis 1 tells us. Although this lesson stops short of the creation of man in verse 26, we read the creation account. As we read the creation account, we become increasingly aware that God carefully prepared all creation for the existence of mankind. Scientists tell us that the Earth orbits the sun at the speed of 19 miles per second and travels 595 million miles per year. Amazingly, these revolutions around the sun are punctual, never missing a second. If the sun were closer to the Earth, we would die of heat. If it were further, we would freeze. The moon's gravity not only creates the tides, it is what keeps the Earth's tilt at near 23.5 degrees, resulting in seasons. Any different, and the temperature variations on the Earth would be much greater. These and many other God-ordained provisions for life are what scientists call the fine-tuning of the universe. The theoretical physicist Stephen Hawking suggested that a vast number of universes exist. He believes that if enough universes exist, then by random chance, one or more could have all that's necessary not only to sustain life, but to be as finely tuned as our planet is for intelligent life to flourish. But the statistical probability of this is infinitesimal. There's simply no scientific explanation for the fine-tuning of our universe that's more likely than that a grand designer carefully planned and arranged everything just as it is. 7 times in Genesis 1, beginning in verse 4, we're told that God saw his creation to be good. The creation in its original state was perfect, unmarred. Here in the 4th verse of the Bible, we learn that God is a moral being. He recognizes and is pleased with a standard he calls good. While the terms separated, gathered, and produced describe aspects of God's creative work in the physical world in Genesis 1, they also reflect his spiritual work within each believer in Jesus Christ. God works to separate the believer from sin. The work of gathering may be related to the broken pieces of our lives. God gathers our hurts and failures and uses them to give us fruitful work. And he produces new life and good works in every believer. According to Genesis 1 through 25, God took what was shapeless and formless and made something good from it. Oh, and nature is indeed a wonder, isn't it? Consider the animal kingdom alone. Marine biologists have photographs taken by special deep sea equipment showing creatures at the bottom of the sea that no human eye has ever seen. And some of these are amazingly complex and beautiful creatures. The various features, abilities, colors, and sizes of animals are a mind-boggling display of God's love of variety, organization, and detail. What God made is surely good. He created good things because he is good. While the transcendence of God may make us fearful, the goodness of God encourages us not to be afraid. My friend, this balance is the right approach to knowing God. In discussing God's goodness, A.W. Tozer writes, "The whole outlook of mankind might be changed if we could all believe that the God of heaven, though exalted in power and majesty, is eager to be friends with us. He is the vast and deep something more for which we long. We long for him, but if he's transcendent, how can we ever know him? While we know him generally by observing creation, the special and specific information we need to really know him is revealed in his written word, the Bible, and in his living word, Jesus Christ. Just as my son wanted his son to know him, the creation account certifies that God desires to reveal himself to us. His goodness invites you and invites me to draw close to him. Have you heard his invitation as you've examined his word this week? Come closer, he invites. You are too small to understand very much, but I want you to know me. I want you to know who I am.